Hello and welcome to Identirati Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue. Today is episode 185. The topic today is the human gap in your identity program. And a quick reminder, please follow us on LinkedIn or YouTube. Help us get to 2,000 followers on LinkedIn. Our guest today is Sean Jurovieski, Senior Security Engineer at SoundCloud. Welcome, Sean.
Thank you. So great to be here today.
So before we dive into the topic, Sean, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about your career trajectory.
Yeah, so I started my career quite like a lot of other people in the space. Um, well, actually, I started my career over in a network operations center just because I was nerding out during the interview and uh, the the COO of the company quite liked to talk about old Cisco routers. But really, while that job was billed as a NOC engineering job, the COO would sell just about any service he could to his customers at his MSSP. So we were doing help desk, we were doing sysadmin work. It was probably like 90% help desk and 10% something's bleeping. I have to escalate this to an actual NOC engineer. um, After that, I moved into a sysadmin role, and I was just finding security issues, fixing them, finding them, fixing them at one of the largest digital marketing firms in the country. Um, my boss, not my boss, a different person, the security person, was one um, security person for 1,700 staff at this company. He was drowning, and I kept finding things like out of alignment with what we testified in our SOC audits, and fixing things and fixing things. And eventually, I got promoted into security. Now I do quite a bit of security architecture, planning, and a lot of focus on our internal identity access management program for both people and non-humans. Um, and I also travel around the world speaking at different conferences like RSA, DEF CON, SecT over in Stockholm. Um, but I do that a little bit more for fun than anything else.
So that was a great intro. Yeah, I wish I could make all those conferences. I'm curtailing my travel a little bit these days. So the topic today is the human gap in your identity program. And I kind of read this like people say that the humans are the weakest link in security. But maybe tell us a little bit about why you chose this particular topic.
I think when you look at your traditional IAM program, it's very focused on just your internal networks, your Active Directory, and everything you're privileging out from there. But you're going to be missing a lot. SaaS is everywhere. So many of us are, Azure AD, Google Workspace, and we're doing things like sign in with Google. We're signing up for things and not telling anyone. And there's so much data being transferred to places that we don't really know about it because it's not in our traditional stack. And I found just building relationships with other departments, having contact points with new hires, um, and ensuring that you're talking to people, you're being a human to people, not a faceless kind of cop, if you will, trying to police what everyone's doing, but trying to act as a partner to what people are doing. They're a lot more willing to talk about their issues to a partner than they are to the security person that's going to get them in trouble.
Yeah, I think that that's true. And I'll jump ahead a little bit. One of the stats was that 90% of employees admitted to undertaking actions they know increase the company's risk. And my take on it was, is that actually a bad thing? Because, I mean, um, everyone who has a car and drives probably drives over the speed limit a couple of times. So it's like, but creating this sort of feedback loop of like honest communication and like treating people like adults, I think is a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, I like to say the point of cybersecurity is to reduce risk. We aren't there to stop and prevent every single breach. Breaches are going to happen. Especially with all the open source weaknesses we've been seeing, you're going to have an issue. What's important is that you ensure the issue can have as little impact as possible, and that you know that the issue actually occurs. So building out these relationships are often the only way you can find out about these things. And I'm much, much more happy to have my staff admit to me that they messed up than to have them try to hide something, obfuscate it, pretend there's no issues there. Because there's going to be issues. So let's just talk about them, get to know them, and try to mitigate them.
So one of the points that I sort of came across to me was this idea of creating a culture of security. And maybe it's because I'm a CEO. I think that culture is one of the jobs really of the CEO himself or herself, themselves. Um, and that, but it can be also difficult because I feel like a lot of CEOs feel somewhat disconnected from IT. Here in Texas, I'm in Austin. I talk to some oil and gas CEOs, and I always throw them under the rug and say they really don't know a lot about IT. Um, and I'm always asking because I'm curious, like what their level of knowledge is and interaction with IT, and they kind of see it as something that somebody else does. Um, so I'm wondering, what are your thoughts about if we move up to if my theory is right that culture emanates, from the CEO and the C-suite down, what does the C-suite actually have to do to set that culture in motion?
I definitely think it emanates from the CEO if the CEO is the founder, but I think our culture where I work probably predates the CEO, and he's doing his best to keep it in place. Um, but I think a lot of what leadership can do is, they don't need to be experts in IT. They don't need to be experts in technology. They need to ensure that they're showcasing and promoting that even they aren't the expert and that they're going to the expert. So maybe talking about, I had this question, it seemed risky to me, and so I talked this over with this person, and they're the expert on it, and this is the advice they gave me. Just being willing to admit, as the CEO, you aren't the expert in every area, and that you yourself are going and asking these questions to other people can really promote it. That yeah, maybe we should go and ask these other people these questions.
Well, I can personally attest that it's very humbling being a CEO because you're really like sort of a general purpose. Like, a little bit about everything, but you're really not the best in anything either. Um, and so I think you're right. We don't want to make the CEO into the one who's driving like the specific ideas. But I also feel like one of the jobs of the CEO and the board, especially, is to govern. Um, and if you say something like, "We want to create a culture of security," as a CEO, to me, that means, okay, how are we going to measure that? There have to be metrics so that I know that we are working towards this culture and that there's a trajectory that we're getting better and we're not getting worse. And to me, that's what governing is about. But it's unclear to me what those metrics might be. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts. And I'd also be willing to pop. You shared one of the homeworks you shared. And by the way, for those of you who don't know, we have a wiki page. It's very geeky. We have a GitHub wiki page for every episode. That's the link for this episode. In the homework section, there's a link to an OWASP effort um, to to create a program around security champions, and they have some great information in there. And they have some advice on approaches to security, and I could show that. But maybe before I do that, Sean, do you have any thoughts on what do you think are the important metrics that would help companies or enterprises build this culture of human um, I guess human centric security?
I think I think it's a difficult question. I think it's difficult to put metrics around a culture. It's a living, breathing thing. Um, I think you could promote metrics about it and showcase these things as wow, we're super involved. But I think when you're doing that, you're probably going to be highlighting a couple of the real human things that happened inside those metrics to really translate them to people. Um, but I think a lot of what you can capture is um, points that the security team's been involved in throughout the year. So threat modeling, how many departments did threat modeling take place in, right? Is it just infrastructure? Is it just front end? Or did the marketing team come and do some threat modeling exercises too? Um, Being able to capture that this is happening across the organization really promotes that this is a global culture of security, instead of something just isolated to only engineers have to worry about that.
Yeah. Um, I want to actually pivot a little bit to the Dashlane article, because you mentioned risk management, and I agree that's the main purpose of security. There's a, if you look at the derivation of the word security, it's securus, so without care, or carefree. And so to me, being if I'm carefree, I can sleep at night because I'm not worried. Um, and so how do we achieve this state of not worrying? We achieve this state by mitigating the biggest risks. So I say, well, I can sleep at night because I know I didn't mitigate all the risks, like you said, that's not possible. But I tried to prioritize the biggest risks, um, and I worked 8 hours today, and I chopped at the biggest ones that I went from top down, and I do that every day, and therefore I can sleep at night because I know I'm doing my best. Um, so risk management is really key, but then the question is, what are the biggest risks? Are employees the biggest risk? Because a lot of this human centric security approach is focused on the humans, especially the workforce in our company. But from a risk management perspective, are the humans, let's say the insiders, really the biggest risk? Or is it perhaps third parties are the biggest risk? We've seen a lot of supply chain attacks. For example, the Solar Winds one was a supply chain attack. There's been a lot of really consequential third party attacks. And I think a lot of people will say that third party is arguably a bigger threat. So I guess from your perspective, does a human centric approach, um, does it really apply when you're is that the right risk to sort of focus on?
Often when I'm prioritizing risks, and the advice that I give to a lot of people is um, prioritize them based on business impact. And by business impact, I mean potential cost to revenue. Um,
Mm-hmm.
if this happens and it's likely to happen as something else, which one is going to financially impact the company more? Because if you're trying to justify budget for your security program to fix a risk, I find being able to explain it in terms of potential cost to the business tends to be the most effective. But then if we're talking about, real risks, there's a statistic that 68% of incidents occur from a non-malicious human factor. They originate with phishing. They're due to a lack of MFA. They're due to someone accidentally doing something. Someone deleted a repo. They shouldn't have had permissions to do that. That's overprivileged. No one maliciously overprivileged that person, but they had the permissions and accidentally did something that they weren't even aware they were doing. Um, so I definitely think a lot of it goes back to the human factors, but we're also just seeing this huge rise in things like Trivy Axios, all of these open source applications in our supply chain that are being compromised. Um, so it's, I think now more than ever that third-party risk is becoming a lot more relevant, especially as we're doing significantly better in terms of identity access management, enforcing multi-factor authentication. I think the scales are balancing, and we'll probably, over the next few years, see an increase in the third-party risks, causing more impact than what we're seeing at the moment, which is the human factors.
Yeah. Actually, I'm just going to, you mentioned MFA and preventing. So phishing is the number one attack, right? So, but it's not necessarily, like you said, the person's not malicious. It's not an insider threat like a bad person. It's just a person who made a mistake. And actually, these phishing emails are really tricky. It's really hard to never make a mistake. I believe that no one should ever send you a stupid link in the email. Like I keep telling my bank, stop sending me links. I don't want your links in my email. If I want to go and interact with you, I'll go to the website. But it seems impossible to stop society from sending links. So I sort of agree with you, and to a certain extent, if we can move people away from passwords, we can prevent their credentials from getting phished at least, because that's just like, I don't know, it's a waste of time. And passkeys are a way to do that because they prevent the secret never leaves the device, or it's non-phishable. Um, but in one of the articles, the Dashlane article, it mentions that it says that the weakest link is the employee credentials. Um, and I'm picking on Dashlane, who I love, by the way, and I'm a Dashlane user. And I love how we can create the security, the vault with a passkey. So I'm not picking on Dashlane, but I'm picking on their assertion that credentials are really the weakest link. You want to pick on Dashlane too, or do you agree with that, or maybe have some other risk in mind?
Yeah, I think credentials are absolutely the weakest link. I mean, what we're seeing Trivi do, what we're seeing the Axios compromise do, what we're seeing Shai Hulud do, is they're compromising your machine to look for credentials. Um, so that definitely does seem to be the most common at the moment, especially if you're having long-lived passwords. But I think I don't know about the weakest link, but it's definitely an impactful weakness. Um, I think there's a lot of new maturity being brought into play with things like Spiffy Spire replacing traditional long-lived secrets with short-lived X509 certificates. And so I think that's really, really mitigating a lot of long-term issues we've seen. But yeah, I definitely think probably just machine identity that's open to the internet, whether it be API keys or something else, is probably one of the weakest of links.
Yeah. So actually, you pivoted a little bit to software credentials from human credentials. I don't know. Dashlane might be right, actually. I had a manager from 2003 when I worked at a large enterprise, and he said the biggest bang for your buck in security is MFA. And Dashlane is saying that 23 years later, that might still be true. They might be right. I don't know. I hope actually, my hope is that the passkeys sort of cheated because it used to be you could increase the friction, you could increase security, but you would increase friction. And the passkey cheat is that actually they increased security and they lowered friction. So, so I am kind of hopeful that as we see passkeys, which are built into the devices, like the laptops and phones or devices, as they're built into the browsers, and the operating systems layer, and then exposing those tools up to the application layer, that we'll see that people will move to passkeys for authentication and hopefully to verifiable credentials for identity. So, but then you raise this other parallel concern, which I think of as software identity. Um, and you mentioned stolen API keys or potentially even stolen private keys for software. And in the industry, we're treating that as a separate segment, popularly called NHI, um, which I'm not a big fan of because I just call it software identity. You're almost always talking about a piece of software calling another piece of software. My problem with NHI is that this is NHI. It's a non-human. Like my cup is an NHI. Um, so I just feel like you can't define something by what it's not, just semantically. It's
I
too broad.
I really, really agree with that. It's the term I use because otherwise people will tell me they don't understand what I'm talking about if I use a
Yeah,
different term. Personally, I prefer machine identity because people like to be fickle with me about what software is. Is it is a Kubernetes node software? Is that a machine? I don't know. I'm just going to call everything a machine. If it runs, it's a machine.
yeah. I'm the only weirdo who calls it software identity, by the way. So I'm on I have my fan of one, like my community of one person. I don't know. I feel like it's software running on the machine. Actually, machine identity is pretty good, but then I feel like people get confused because they always think that there's a piece of hardware. If you call it a machine, they think it's a piece of hardware. But these days we have a lot of when you look at Spiffy, for example. Spiffy allows a piece of software to obtain an identifier. It doesn't include authentication, by the way. I guess it could if you issue it an X509 cert along along the way. Um, but Spiffy doesn't specify X509. But anyway, we're seeing that in one machine, one physical cloud server running, might have multiple services, each with a Spiffy ID, and multiple workloads. Workload's the other one I heard. I was on the workload bandwagon for a while, but I think workload, when I'm talking about an app running on my phone, or when I'm talking about a browser-based application running in my browser, like a React or one of these other types of browser, Angular,
Mhm.
that's an app, and you call that a workload. I think workload tends to be very cloud. So anyway, I think this is an area where um, whatever we call it, the question is secrets management for these workloads, and it seems to me pretty clear that the answer is software. Let's just go with software. Should use asymmetric authentication. Um, what's more challenging is where do we store those private keys, and how do we manage them, and how do we manage the life cycle? What are some of the challenges you see around this? Assuming that we can do away with shared secrets, because that's really bad. What API keys is just a password. And hopefully, and it could be a password without a username. Sometimes they're both the identifier and which is even worse. Um, but the trend is let's move to asymmetric secrets. But then the question I have for you is, what are some of the challenges organizations face around the private key management for all these different services, even if they
Mhm.
can move to asymmetric secrets?
So with with what I've seen as a common trend in this lately is that a lot of standards and software running these types of things like Istio and the Spiffy project has their own service, Spire. They're moving back to credential authorities and having an authoritative server that is issuing those types of credentials. And then you have to renew its root cert every so often. But it removes a lot of the management of all of the secrets across your environment except for that core secret. or if you're going to have other federated CA servers with that one, then there's all of their own secrets as well. Um, and I do think things like Vault, things like AWS Secrets Manager have a purpose for those types of longer lived things, and it's really important to prioritize eliminating all of the things that should be shorter lived, that should um, especially that can be shorter lived. You're not going to want to rotate your CA's root cert every single day. That seems like quite a pain, but it makes quite a bit of sense if, especially if you're working with um, short-lived services that are spinning up nodes to complete a task and then they're going away. It doesn't make sense to issue them a long-lived secret somewhere far out in your own environment.
Yeah, I probably, I'm very interested in this topic. Glue is in the identity and access management business. Half of what we do is software identity. So, but I should probably spool back into the topic before we digress too far. Um, and because we're talking about the humans here, and I think the humans also have challenges. Now, you mentioned AWS secrets management, the technology stack for managing these asynchronous secrets, the private keys. It's not for the it's hard. Um, but focusing back towards the humans a little bit, one of the answers we see a lot in compliance, like SOC 2 or ISO, um, is about training the humans. Um, and I wonder, so the OWASP guidelines talk about more frequent training and engagement, and sort of more continuous learning. Trying to bring the humans along. But going back what you said about business impact. Um, as a CEO, I want my employees to be thinking about what has the most business impact, and I'm not sure security training is that. So what's the right amount of security training, do you think? And um, and is there a trend maybe where we can use AI to help reduce the cognitive load so that we're not having to train the humans? They can keep less in the human context window, which is really small.
So I think with impact, especially business impact, I've heard complaints from executives at past roles about why are we updating our software? Why should our staff have to worry about um, spending 20 minutes in the morning having their laptop update? And my answer to that is often, well, we have to we have to update the laptop. Apple showcased some pretty nasty vulnerabilities in that last uh, software that they're patching right now. But I agree. I don't think mandating people go and take courses that they're going to zone out in and just click next, next, next through is useful. I think engaging people where they are is helpful, showcasing how to exploit a vulnerability, so you should avoid it, and just having open invitations, asking people on various teams to showcase any cool hacks that they've seen themselves, and then also bringing it to them right right in their work patterns. So we're using Aikido for SAS scanning, DAS scanning, um, those types of things. And Aikido in people's PR, it writes up comments about, hey, this is actually vulnerable to this. You should maybe change it to this. And then they'll have a link to their own internal explainer that goes into more depth about why that's a vulnerability. And we've heard feedback from quite a few staff that it feels a bit educational to them, and it's helped them have those things pop up less because they've known, hey, okay, the way I wrote that piece of code was insecure, so I'm gonna turn into um, a variable instead of just having people be able to input any type of text into that field.
Yeah, and the tools are getting getting really good. Anthropic, of course, introduced Mythos, which they haven't released yet, but these tools are getting better at code scanning. And I wonder if agentic tools maybe couldn't run in the browser. I know running in the browser is terrifying, but like I'm terrified of OpenClaw. It seems like a really bad idea to me to let an agent impersonate you. It seems like the pattern of like what we shouldn't be doing, the anti-pattern. Um, but what about an agent? If we want to stop phishing, maybe we could have an agent that says, "You sure you want to click on that email?" Or, um, um, or I don't know. Maybe just I feel like maybe it's wishful thinking, but maybe we can get some more help from agents to help us be more secure, and they're going to be able to keep more things in mind than we will be able to remember from our security training.
I think it seems like it could waste quite a lot of compute and tokens having an agent scan every single link instead of having agents train on, optimal rules for, hey, that link looks suspicious or goes to a suspicious looking website. But I definitely think those things are emerging. I would not be surprised if email engines have those types of integrated AI features quite shortly. Um, but I also I'm a firm believer that every single agent, every single AI usage should have its own discrete identity. It should never be piggybacking on your own identity. And in my mind, one of the top rules of AI usage is AI should be immediately identifiable as AI, both from workload and any gates or disclosures. If you're popping into a meeting, you should be warned that, hey, this is being recorded by AI, and you should have to agree to it because if they just kind of sneak in there, it feels a little bit. It, I find it leaves a little bit of a bad taste in your mouth with a new vendor you might be evaluating if there's just someone sitting in the meeting that's the AI, or maybe it has a catchy name and you don't even realize at first that that is an AI. It's just Jeffrey, our note taker.
Yeah. I haven't seen that yet, but that is sort of terrifying. And um, well, um, actually, I wanted to hassle you a little bit about something you said before about open source security vulnerabilities. Um, so, full disclosure, Glue is a commercial distribution of an upstream open source distribution. Um, and so the Janssen project at the Linux Foundation's our upstream distribution. So I'm open source like oriented in my thinking, and I believe that open source leads to more innovation over the long term, and that creating a safe supply chain for open source is critical for software writ large, because almost all software is built on these open source foundations. Um, but the thing I wanted to sort of point out was that there will be software vulnerabilities in this open source supply chain. Um, but like you said, it's like good for your employees to tell you or your team members if they violate security. This transparency with the open source is also good. And having less transparency in commercial code, it might not be quite as good as having full transparency. And I wanted to point out that the Mythos Anthropic tool, the big concern is that it's scanning operating systems and browsers that are not open source. So it seems to me like the hackers maybe don't need your source code to find these vulnerabilities. And some of the worst vulnerabilities have been in commercial code, like Microsoft Active Directory. Or you mentioned Cisco routers. Also, there's no open source Cisco firmware, and yet the hackers keep hacking Cisco routers. And so I'm curious about your thoughts on, it might be a little bit of a digression here, but is open source really does it deserve to be sort of called out for security here?
I don't think so. I mean, I don't think those kind of I don't think those supply chain issues are only tied to open source. And I think that a lot of I mean, the Axios vulnerability didn't uh, compromise someone that worked at Axios. It didn't just compromise the open source project, it compromised an actual employee of a company. So I don't necessarily think that was an open source vulnerability that occurred. Um, and I think it's, like you said, quite a bit more likely that those vulnerabilities are going to showcase there. I just think supply chain has been a huge issue for a really, really long time. And I think this is really showcasing that issue. Um, and I think a lot of it goes to show that we really do need to um, focus a lot on protecting our repos, protecting our source code, and um, also we should be supporting um, open source projects because they don't have the resources that these massive proprietary companies do to do all these security steps. Yet they often do them quite a bit better. Um, so I'm a huge fan of open source. SoundCloud itself actually um, founded the Prometheus um, open
Oh
source
yeah,
project,
yeah,
and so that originated from us. But I'm a huge fan of open source. It definitely is something I love. It's something I hope help to contribute to a little bit in my own free time, even though I'm not much of a developer myself. Um, and it's also something that our security vendor Aikido, something that we really liked about it was they helped found OpenSem. They are a core contributor to OpenSem. So these are all things that that we prioritize and that I tend to prioritize myself when evaluating what software to use because your software is inherently going to be audited by the open internet and rather than whatever team of people are at whatever proprietary company.
yeah. It's interesting, and I think this is we're still like there's this big digital transformation going on in our society, and open source is part of that. And I think that at the Linux Foundation, they have the Open SSF, which is trying to drive better um, a safer software supply chain. So I think this is really and we're still evolving. Like here, it's still a moving target. Um, but so pivoting back to the human side, you mentioned that these agents potentially might be impersonating humans. And so this is creating, we mentioned phishing as a big vulnerability, but now it's almost like, okay, now we have agents that are actually have access, instead of phishing the credentials, the agents running in your browser, it's just grabbing the token that you actually, the valid token, but maybe presenting it in ways that you don't even know about or realize. So it seems like the agentic, this trend towards agentic software, especially this open claw type software running in the browser, might present a new challenge for the humans. And um, what is I don't know if you can disclose this, but like, what is does SoundCloud have a policy about OpenClaw or browser agents? If I was running, we have a small company at Glue, so I just say you can't run these things, full stop. Like you can't use OpenClaw. But what's sort of the take on these sort of new tools? And is this a new type of shadow IT to worry about in a way?
Being EU based, we have to worry about our compliance with the EU AI Act and GDPR. And so we've taken a stance that every single AI tool, regardless of if it's open source or not, needs to be individually reviewed and approved by our internal AR Governance Council. We're hoping to create, as we go through all these reviews, we're hoping to create templates for approved use cases and approved tools so that we can migrate through that faster since so many people are coming to us with so many things. But as far as OpenClaw goes, if I visit that website or query its API, Sentinel-1 is going to nuke my browser. Um, so we've named quite a few of the tools by name to say, if you go to this website, your session's going to be terminated, just because they present such an enormous risk. I mean, I was reading an article the other day about OpenClaw going and creating dating profiles without knowledge or consent of the people using it. And there's,
AI is looking for love. Great.
I guess so. Or maybe
Um,
it thinks you're burning too many tokens, so it's finding someone to distract you.
okay, so my last we've almost survived your first IOH live stream, and if you come back on the show, you'll be IOH alumni. You won't have to do your intro again. But my last question is about policy management. Um, there's been a trend in the industry towards centralizing policy management. It's supposed to be a best practice, but applications, you mentioned SaaS applications. We have Windows like legacy applications. We have cloud applications. We have local applications. Each of them implement security in a different way. And so this idea of centralized policy management seems like more like a dream than a reality. And I'm just curious if you had any thoughts on what's the state of centralized policy management, and what do you think the trajectory of it is for the future?
So you mean policy management, as in your own internal policies, not things like OPA, right?
Yeah, like a
Um,
policy could be we don't have any unencrypted public S3
mhm,
buckets, or just like the things of the policies that the company holds true. And I guess they could map to compliance. Like you could say, oh, we have a SOC 2 requirement for this, and so we have a policy that implements that. But ideally there's probably more policies than compliance, because the
mhm,
compliance tends to be a subset of actually what you need to do, but there's business agreements that require you to do other things, and um, and there just might be things that your security department says this is a good idea, even though it's not a SOC 2 requirement. We have a
yeah.
policy about this, but
Um,
those policies should represent or mitigate the risk, um, but the where they live and how they get reviewed seems to be somewhat amorphous.
yeah, it is quite difficult. So we tend to go for the approach of policy being quite a broad subject. So all data must be encrypted at rest might be the policy. All data must only be internal unless there's a specific exception. And then we'll have a procedure that says S3 buckets must all be encrypted. S3 buckets open to the internet need to have a stated exemption for why they're open to the internet. And then that will be our procedure. And so our policy can cover all of the different use cases in a really broad term. And then we'll write more specific procedures. And then what we tend to do is go about getting specific approvals from legal and executives about our policies. And then our procedures are up to us as long as they can conform to the policies that they inform.
Right. But now, let's say you have a developer who's writing an AI tool or a microservice, and that developer wants to know that developer wants to implement these policies, or how do developers sort of hook into that policy infrastructure and know that the code that they're writing aligns with the policies that have been set by the company?
So what you could do is utilize a tool like Open Policy Agent, which is a graduate CNCF project that can help mandate certain things for your infrastructure as code
Yeah.
to ensure that they're in compliance with those policies. But at the end of the day, what you have to do is ask that they submit a threat model for it, that you review it, and we don't really have time to go through each single microservice that's proposed, but um, we can go through the different templates of, does this fit into an existing thing? If it fits into an existing thing, if you're building off an existing piece of infrastructure as code for this new service or project using existing components, and maybe you had to create a couple new components and modules for it, well, then we can review those new components and modules without having to dive into depth with the whole thing as a whole. Or maybe it just completely fits into existing templates that we already have, so it's not something that we need to do. Um, a lot of it also comes to ensuring, permissions management aren't going to let people deploy something brand new and unreviewed directly into your infrastructure.
Right. And I agree with that. So it sounds like what you're saying, you called out OPA specifically, but we could just say some type of policy engine. If you're a developer, instead of hard coding your policies, maybe move to some type of standardized policy engine that hooks into the policy management. And I think that is sort of the trend I was alluding to, is that we are looking to sort of standardize how sort of policies almost becoming like code. Um, and perhaps this plays into also how we can help humans more. Well, I'm sorry I went over on time. I should have, the pigeon should be flying at 41 minutes and we're at 46 minutes. So I went way over, which is not like me, but I apologize. Um, I will just quickly announce the next episode. We have one of the legends of internet security, Dick Hart, top level author of the OAuth 2 6749 RFC OAuth framework, Dick Hart. He has a new, it wasn't enough to invent, cloud security. He's now trying to invent agent security. So he's been working with some others on this new protocol called AAuth. So we're going to talk about that next time. Rohit Kare will be my co-host on that on Thursday. Quick logistical reminder, please follow us on LinkedIn or YouTube. Again, trying to get to 2,000 users. And with that, I will say thank you very much, audience. Thank you, Sean, so much for volunteering a bunch of your time for this project and for the great content. And we'll see you next time.
Yeah, thank you so much.